Sugar is a chronic, dose-dependent hepatotoxin. Now, what do I mean by that? Chronic. So, one sugar meal, not a problem. 2 sugar meals, not a problem. But 10,000 sugar meals, that's a problem. And since every one of our meals is now spiked with added sugar, 10,000 sugar meals is 10 years. Now it's chronic. Dose dependent. Obviously, a little is okay. And that's what we used to get. But a lot is not. And that's what we get now. And the reason we get it is because all of our food now has added sugar, whereas that was not true previously. And finally, hepatotoxin, liver toxin. What happens to sugar when it's metabolized in the liver is it gets turned to liver fat. That liver fat has to be exported out of the liver. Our ability to do so is relatively inefficient. A lot of it ends up staying in the liver, causes liver dysfunction and liver disease, causes the pancreas to have to make extra insulin to make the liver do its job. That raises insulin levels all over the body. That drives energy into fat, contributing to obesity. Also, the liver disease contributes to problems with being able to process sugar. You now have diabetes. The high insulin causes blood vessels to contract. Now you have hypertension. In addition, heart disease, fatty liver. Ultimately, that high insulin can cause cell proliferation. Now you've got cancer. And we now know that high insulin in the brain is part of the pathogenesis of dementia. So, is it toxic in high dose? Absolutely. In long term? Absolutely. Now, how about addictive? It works on the reward center the same way that it works, that alcohol works on the reward center. It basically tells your brain you want more. And so you have now a vicious cycle of consumption and disease. So, sugar is both toxic and addictive when supplied in high dose. The low-fat diet was a terrible mistake. I understand where it came from, but it was a terrible mistake. It was based on inappropriate precepts that were not well thought out. In the process of going low-fat, the food tasted like cardboard. The food industry knew that. So what did they do? Add sugar. And then everything tastes good. Example, milk. I grew up on whole milk, and it was perfectly fine, and everybody was happy with it. Then we went to skim milk, and the kids wouldn't drink it in school. What do? Add the chocolate. So which was worse, the sugar or the fat? By far and away the sugar. Big time. So the low-fat diet basically became the high-sugar diet. And as we processed food with high sugar, we also took away the one antidote that we had in our diet for that sugar, and that was the fiber. And the reason is because you can't freeze fiber. So processed food is high sugar, low fiber. Real food is low sugar, high fiber. This is a processed food problem. 3 words. Eat real food. Michael Pollan in the United States said, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. That's 7 words. I'll make it simpler. 3 words. Eat real food. If it has a nutrition facts label, it's been processed. Real food doesn't need a label. It's expensive, and that's a problem. But ultimately, government has to help us be able to eat real food by making it available and affordable. All right? So I'm going to show you why this doesn't work. And here's what, but before I show you why it doesn't work, I'm going to show you that this was a battle royal back in the 1970s. Okay? This was not a simple thing. There were people lined up on both sides of this story. Okay? So this over here is a book, 1972 it came out, and it was called Pure, White, and Deadly. It's all about sugar. Okay? Written by a British physiologist, nutritionist, endocrinologist by the name of John Yudkin. Now, I never knew John Yudkin. He's passed away. Okay? But I read this book about a year ago, and without even knowing it, I was a Yudkin acolyte. I was a Yudkin disciple. Every single thing that this man said in 1972 is the God's honest truth. And if you want to read a true prophecy, you find this book. It's not easy to find, but you go find this book, and I'm telling you, every single thing this guy said has come to pass. It's astounding. I am in awe of this guy. But on the other side, we had this guy over here. Okay, his name was Ancel Keys. Anybody heard of him? Okay, so Ancel Keys was a Minnesota epidemiologist, very interested in the cause of cardiovascular disease, and he performed the first multivariate regression analysis without computers. Now, anybody know what that means? Multivariate regression analysis? Okay, so this is where you take a whole lot of data, okay, and normally you would just, run a few computer programs, but basically the object is to try to figure out what causes what, and to try to factor out other things and determine what the contribution of various things all at once are to an outcome that you're looking for. So he was interested in cardiovascular disease, and so what he did was he did this study, along with other people around the world, called the 7 Countries Study. Okay? Very famous, front page of Time magazine in 1980. Okay? So here's the data on the 7 Countries Study. So we have the US, we have Canada, Australia, England, Wales, Italy, Japan. Okay? And here's percent calories from fat on the x-axis, and here we have coronary disease death rate on the y-axis. And so you'd say, well, look at that. I mean, it's very obvious, isn't it? Sure. Percent calories from fat correlates very nicely with coronary disease. Right? Except for one little problem. Anybody see it? Japan and Italy. So how much sugar do they eat? Didn't I tell you the Japanese diet eliminates fructose? They never even had it till we brought it to them after World War II. Italy, aside from gelato, I mean, what else they got? Okay? They got a lot of pasta, there's a lot of glucose, but no fructose. Okay? There's no sugar in the Italian diet other than the occasional sweet, which they moderate. They're very careful about moderating, and they cost a lot. Okay? But here we got England, Wales, Canada, Australia, US. We are sugarholics, aren't we? We're also fataholics. So in fact, the fat migrated with the sugar. So this is from Keyes's own work. Okay, page 262, if you want to pick up the 500-page volume. Okay, and I'm just going to read you the one paragraph, okay, that talks about this. The fact that the incidence rate of coronary heart disease was significantly correlated with the average percentage of calories from sucrose in the diet is explained by the intercorrelation of sucrose with saturated fat. In other words, donuts. Okay? Wherever there was the fat, there was sucrose too. Because these guys here eat donuts. Partial correlation analysis show that with saturated fat constant, there was no significant correlation between dietary sucrose and the incidence of coronary heart disease. Okay. When you do a multivariate linear regression analysis, you have to do it both ways. You have to do holding sucrose fat constant showing that sucrose doesn't work, and then you have to hold sucrose constant and show that fat still works. You see that anywhere? He didn't do it. He didn't do it. He didn't do the thing that you need to do a multivariate linear regression analysis. Now, this was done before computers. We can't check the work. He's dead. He died in 2004. So, we're left with a conundrum. Do we believe this? Do we believe this study? Because we based 30 years of nutrition, education and information and policy in this country on this study. And as far as I'm concerned, it has a hole as big as the one in the USS Cole. All right? You got it? Everybody, am I debunking? Yes? No?
Hi there! So I'd like to talk to you about this book. It's called Pure, White and Deadly. And it was written by a British professor by the name of John Yudkin back in the early 1970s. It's basically an expose of sugar and all the horrendous things that sugar does to our health. Now, fortunately, when it came out in the 1970s, John Yudkin and his work were pulled to pieces. He was written off as a crank, his work was dismissed and mocked. He was bullied by the food industry and the sugar industry, unsurprisingly, and other people who worked in the field of nutrition. The book actually went out of print, and it was only republished years and years later, actually fairly recently. And in the interim, the tragedy is that our consumption of sugar just exploded in the intervening decades. And with it, the incidence of obesity worldwide and type 2 diabetes worldwide and a host of other chronic diseases. So millions of people lost their health because this man who wrote this book, which was basically prophetic. It was a prophecy in this book. He saw which way the wind was blowing and he called it on sugar. And yet no one listened. So he was just shouting in the wilderness and his message went completely ignored and forgotten actually for a very, very long time. So I was so incensed when I read about how John Yudkin was treated and how he'd been bullied that I decided to make a little animation in his honour, because I really believe that the world should know the name of John Yudkin and his message and how he tried to save the world from sugar. So my hope is that belatedly the world will wake up and that we're not doomed to just repeat the same mistakes over and over again, but that we will now listen to John Yudkin. He passed away many, many years ago, but his book is here. His message is more relevant today than ever. So I'll put a link below to the animation. Please do share it. We need to get the message out about sugar. So thank you so much for watching. Bye.
I think it was the work of my father, not necessarily kick-started it, but certainly that he was one of the major advocates of looking at the question of what sugar did to you in terms of metabolism, what diseases it was associated with, and ultimately, as a result of his research over quite a number of years, he came to the conclusion that it really was a dangerous foodstuff. His book was called Pure, White and Deadly. It was published in 1972. It summarized really for an intelligent lay audience the kind of work that he had been doing, the kind of work that other people had been doing in different parts of the world, and made a very convincing case, I think, for the view that one has to be very careful about the amount of sugar that one ate, and actually eating none was probably best of all. The book was ridiculed to a substantial extent. It was really the subject of a hatchet job, largely by the food industry. And although many people individually bought it and were interested in it, and even today people come up to me and say, was it I that wrote the book? And I have to say, no, it was actually my father who wrote it. So there was obviously a lot of interest in it, but at a professional level, I think it was poo-pooed and he was regarded as a bit of a crank. We hear a lot about fat, we hear a lot about salt. We don't hear enough, in my view, about sugar, and certainly nutritionists would do well, I think, to inquire into the diet of people who consult them, and also should themselves spread the message about sugar, because it is an inessential component of the diet. There is no reason that we have to have sugar. We have to have this, we have to have that, but we don't ever have to have sugar in order to function healthily. I'm not sure to what extent my father would have thought it a good idea that government should regulate food, and in particular sugar and sugar-containing beverages, for example, because I think in his days it was generally thought that if you explained to people individually that a particular component of their diet wasn't doing them much good, that would be enough to diminish their consumption. We now know, I think, as a result of work over the last 30 or 40 years, that such attempts to influence people individually are not at all successful. And it may be that, as we have done with tobacco, there has been a lot of taxation, there's been a great deal of propaganda against tobacco. We may now have got to a situation where the number of diseases and the severity and frequency of the diseases associated with the consumption of sugar has got so bad that we have to take further efforts. That would be the way to do it, I think.